Hey art nerds, we have another Etegami tutorial for you guys today. Today we're going to paint a daylily bud that's just about to burst into bloom. So here is our reference image. Feel free to open and pause this video in another tab if you want to work along with me. The materials you're going to need for this tutorial are a small watercolor palette. You can also use a ceramic plate. Some watercolors. Gansai style watercolors really work best for Etegami. I'm using the Moz Art Komorebi palette, but you could use the Kuretake Gansai Tambi palette or any Gansai style watercolors or Chinese watercolors. We're also using Etegami watercolor paper. We're using some chipboard to form a support. We're using various size sumi brushes. And fortunately, sumi brushes are very affordable for watercolor brushes, so these should not be a hardship. We're going to be using the Pentel pigment brush pins in medium and extra fine, with the extra fine one being the one with the slightly translucent top. We're going to use some white gouache to later add accents, some washi tape to help adhere our paper to our chipboard, and you guys can find a list as well as links to all the materials used in this tutorial, so you can just go and pick them all up at one time. Don't even have to leave the house. So the first thing I want to do is I want to secure my Etegami paper to my chipboard. So I'm removing my paper. Now the thing about Etegami paper is it's very different from Western style watercolor. It typically has either like a Nikoma sort of gesso effect, Nikoma primer to hold onto the pigments. It could also have an alum primer, or it has a washi paper on it. So it's going to handle very differently from Western style watercolor. You can totally do this on cellulose style watercolor paper, quite like the Canson XL pad that you guys see being used as a structural support. So I applied my washi tape to the underside of my arm. That's just to remove some of the adhesive from the tape so it doesn't tear up my paper. And then I affix it to our chipboard. This is going to help prevent it from buckling all over the place, and it's also going to hold it still while I do my sketching. So I'm using a regular mechanical pencil. I think it has HB lead in it, and I'm just lightly sketching a daylily bud as well as the little offshoot buds that are going on here. Once that's finished, I'm going to start blocking in the background. So I'm using a cool yellow to do this, and we're going to work from light to dark. That's really one of the best ways to work with watercolor, and we really want to take advantage of the bleed properties of this paper. So quite frequently, Etegami papers are designed for maximum bleeding and feathering. That is a working property of the paper. It's not a flaw in the paper. It's something we actually want. And that gives us this sort of immediacy and freshness to our watercolor art. And it really encourages us to work a little bit lighter. So Etegami is not intended to be photorealistic, which makes it a very accessible art form for artists of all ages. It's really intended instead to be expressive and to celebrate the seasonality. So since we're painting in spring, I'm going to be painting a lot of spring flowers. Now that I've applied my yellow, I'm just dabbing in some lighter green and allowing it to blend out. And you can see how much the green and the yellow move on this paper. Next, I'm dabbing in some darker, cooler green as well as some blue and allowing that to diffuse as well. Now I'm going to give my background a chance to dry. I want to point out that this video has been sped up by about 2 times. So this is a 1 hour to 2 hour activity, depending on how humid your local area is. If you live in a less humid area, it's going to dry a lot quicker. So I'm applying a warmer yellow to our Daylily bud, and I am leaving some white areas. I'm going to go back in later with a pink, and while I do want some diffusion, I don't want it to just totally diffuse into the yellow. Next, I'm dabbing in some light green at the tip and allowing that to diffuse as well. And then I'm going in with our pink and allowing it to diffuse. I'm going to step away and give this a chance to dry. Now I'm going to work on some of the surrounding buds, although I am going to dip a little bit more green to diffuse since it got kind of lost in the yellow. So I apply the cooler yellow to these smaller buds. If you guys look at the reference image, you'll notice that these buds are a bit like green bananas, where there's a lot of yellow, but there's also a lot of green. So I'm also dipping in some of the lighter green and allowing it to diffuse into the yellow. And I'm going to do this for all of the smaller buds. Next, I'm going to go in with some of the pink I used on the larger Daylily, and I'm going to just carefully line it in on the second largest bud and then reapply it to the largest bud. I also painted the stem with yellow ochre, and while it's still wet, I'm dipping in some of the green, or some green where the buds connect to the stem, and allowing that to diffuse. So while that dries, I'm going to work on the background a bit more. I'm applying some yellow using a smaller sumi brush in leaf-like shapes. Then I go in with the lighter green and start adding some leaf-like shapes. And with the yellow, I left a lot of gaps and spaces, so this isn't just completely wet into wet. We're going to have some wet into wet blending, but we're also going to have some sharper lines. Then I go in with a blue and I start drawing in more leaf-like shapes. And I'm trying to keep most of the blue to the bottom half of the illustration just to help provide some shadow and some contrast. So that's what our background looks like as of right now. Now that everything's had a chance to dry, I'm going to start adding some more details and tightening things up. So I'm going back in with the warmer yellow and reapplying it to our larger bud. I'm also applying it in some areas to our second largest bud, as well as the buds in the background. And since this has had a chance to dry, I reestablished our pink, and it's a much sharper delineated line. Since it's had a chance to dry, it's not blending quite as much. I also added some Venetian red to the stem. Now that it's had a chance to dry, I'm going to go in and add some more leaf forms. So I'm starting with our cooler blue and adding small blue leaf forms to the background. I'm also adding some green to the tops of the buds and adding a little bit more delineation to the buds using green, because you can see we've kind of lost a little bit with all the wet into wet. The wet into wet blending adds a lot of freshness and liveliness. It adds kind of a chaotic energy to it, and we can kind of rein that back in by adding tighter details if you wish. You may decide you really like the loose wet into wet, and you may decide to embrace that aspect of Etegami painting. I'm also adding some more lighter green leaves into the background as well. Using a smaller Etegami brush, I'm going to start adding some more tighter, finer details into our Daylily buds, including into the pink. So I've added a little bit of red to our pink just to continue to add that delineation. So you can start to see the individual lobes of the bud itself. I'm also adding just a little bit of our cooler blue to the smaller buds, and then I added some Payne's Gray into the stem. I allowed the watercolor to dry fully, and now I'm going in with our Pentel pigment brush pens, and I'm just going to start outlining it. And I really love these brush pens. I'm using the extra fine one here. It almost handles like a brush. And what's really beautiful about these brush pens is you can get really clean, crisp lines, but if you move quickly, you can also get these really nice, gritty, dry brush kind of lines, which are just kind of perfect for adding additional immediacy. The extra fine has a really long brush to it, so you can get really fine lines, but you can also get much larger, thicker, chunkier lines. So these are really expressive brush pens that are a lot of fun to use. I'm also going to add just a few leaf shapes in ink to the background. And I decided to add just a few striations to the bud itself. So I'm adding just a little bit of white gouache to my palette. I'm going to mix in a little bit of water, and we're going to use this to add just a few white highlights and kind of help pull the buds out from the background. Since everything is kind of at the same level of detail and contrast, it's really important to try and pop our foreground, our focal images, our focal subject out from the background. And sometimes you can do that by adding just a little bit of extra white. And then I decide I'm going to add some white leaf shapes to the background too, which was not the best idea. But that's okay. I share my mistakes with you guys so you guys can learn from them. And really, the only or one of the best ways to learn through art is by trying new things, making mistakes, and deciding that that doesn't work for you. And that's one of the things I really like about Etegami is it's designed to be quick, it's designed to be fairly easy, it's designed to be very approachable, so you can try lots of different things and make mistakes. So very carefully I remove the paper from the chipboard, and then I carefully peel the washi tape from the back of my postcard, and there you have it, a finished Etegami postcard. This was really fun. I don't paint a lot of buds even though I paint a lot of flowers, and spring buds are just such a seasonal thing, and this one was just so ready to bloom. I really wanted to capture that life and that vitality. So thank you guys so much for joining me for this Etegami tutorial. I hope you guys found it useful and inspiring, and I sincerely hope it inspires you guys to try painting as well. Watercolor is easier than people give it credit for, and it's so much more approachable as well. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye, guys.